Hello there, and welcome back to The Disconnected. I'm here with Paul Farrell, which is somebody that one of my patrons actually originally had asked me to seek out as a guest. Paul is somebody that I'd seen tangentially through a couple other things, primarily on Twitter, but when somebody asked, I was like, yeah, obviously, that's a great choice. Paul, thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Paul is... I don't even know how to start this because it seems like you have like 19 projects all the time. First off, right now, you are a part of Dead Ringers podcast. You've got the Scream Addicts, columnist, Epilepsy Disgusting, which there's a couple of those that I wanted to touch on a little bit because, oh man, I love me some Weird Al. And then...
Yes.
Then you do a handful of other things that people might know as well, like the scriptophobic stuff. First of all, what all is going on with you? Because there's so much.
Well, I appreciate that. No, I mean, I love movies. I love movies. I love horror movies. So I kind of sign up for a lot of stuff, maybe sometimes to my detriment. But no, I mean, yeah, you talked about the main stuff. Dead Ringers is kind of the first thing that, well, I guess Scriptophobics was the first column I ever did, and that was written in blood. So that was sort of a script to screen analysis of like special effects in movies.
Right.
Dead Ringers is a double feature podcast hosted by a bunch of different people. It's like a rotating bench of hosts. Nolan McBride kind of runs the whole thing. But we do double features. We take two movies that sort of have shared DNA, but may not always necessarily be movies you would immediately connect, and just have conversations about those. Scream Addicts is something where we've been doing something called the Hammer Pub, where we actually just finished up, where we ran through all of Hammer's major horror movies and did a commentary. So that was pretty cool. So, that was with Jinx and Allie, my two co-hosts over there. And then, yeah, like you mentioned on Bloody Disgusting, I do one-off articles, and then I also do a column on Goosebumps books and Hammer movies. The Goosebumps one is just sort of analyzing the TV episode from the 90s with its book. And then the Hammer one is taking a look at the Scream Factory Hammer releases, which I'm sure we'll get into. But Scream Factory has been doing the Lord's work in the U.S. and finally making great editions and definitive editions of these movies available to people over here.
I mean, there's so much I want to get into and try to touch on at least all of them. So first off, Dead Ringers. Like, one of the things that I've always loved is the actual artistry of film programming. And a lot of people don't understand maybe how much thought some people really bring it on themselves to do that. And the fact that you're curating perhaps an entire night of entertainment or an entire festival of entertainment for either a theater full of people or potentially like a community, literally, depending on how you're viewing this. And even just a double feature can make or break, like, not to make it more dramatic, but like a friendship sometimes. There could be certain things where you can have such an enjoyable night that it like solidifies a bond, or just have just an awful choice and somebody goes, you know what? Maybe I'm not friends with them, obviously, if they're going to choose a film like this. So maybe either through Dead Ringers or something that you've done on your own, what would you say is a really great double feature that you've either curated for yourself or talked about on Dead Ringers or something else where they're sort of linked, but maybe not exactly something that would come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree with you. I think programming a night of entertainment or something film fans kind of really rally behind and can kind of fall in love with. With Dead Ringers, some of my personal favorite pairings, probably one that jumps to mind would be the Night of the Demon, or I guess over here it was called Curse of the Demon.
Right.
Which was what year was it? 1957 British horror film. And then Drag Me to Hell, Sam Raimi's film from the mid 2000s. I love pairing like the old with the new, and finding through lines that, are there, but may not be immediately apparent. And then having like deep discussions about them. we did one, Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much, and Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, which was kind of fun because The Girl Who Knew Too Much was sort of the genesis of the Giallo movement.
Right.
So it was cool and then obviously like a lot of people kind of look at Psycho as a reaction to that and different things. So I guess a precursor to that as well, because that would have been a bit before. But, there's just some fun things you can get into with disparate styles or, international things that may not immediately jump to mind, which I know we'll talk about Hammer here in a minute. But I've always been a champion of movies that I think are underseen, even if you've heard, like, there's a lot of movies people have heard of, like I think everyone's heard of like Christopher Lee in the Dracula cycle, in the Hammer Dracula cycle, or Peter Cushing in the Frankenstein cycle. But I think a lot of people haven't seen those movies, or have maybe seen the first one, but not, all 7 or whatever it is. And I think there's a lot of horror fans that just kind of have the knowledge and think that's enough. Like, oh, well, I'm aware of it, and I can just kind of leave it there, not realizing what they might be depriving themselves of by not diving into some of these older movies. So a lot of times when I do doubles, I try to pick something that's maybe older or slightly harder to see, and find something maybe more populous that they can kind of relate it to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems like the best double features are ones that will introduce people to one film and then really rally the crowd together for the second film. And those types of nights are always fun because they leave buzzing, but then they're excited about the other film that they were subjected to for the first time.
Yeah,
and like the Bava thing, it seems like there are so many people that are either just now wanting to get into Bava, and the hard part is a lot of Bava stuff is going out of print from some of these physical media places, or they've just never got into it and just assumed, it's Bava. I've seen maybe one, and I'm good. So it's tough when you get people that want to discuss things like this and sound maybe semi-scholarly, or at least what they know what they're talking about. But double features like that are some of the best ways to subject to that. And one of the things that got me into horror when I was younger is Goosebumps. So with your bloody disgusting stuff, where did that come from? Were you big into Goosebumps when you were younger? Yeah.
Goosebumps was probably, I'd have to really look at the dates. Either Goosebumps or the television show Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Yep.
One of those two things is kind of one of the big responsibilities for why I think I now love horror. I liked Goosebumps pretty much right out the gate. It was in my school. I mean, I think it was like this in a lot of elementary schools, but it was kind of a phenomenon. Like every kid was talking about Goosebumps. I've written about it, but for me, like, I remember going to the school library like every single day and asking the librarian, hey, do you have any Goosebumps books? And the answer was always no. And, running over to the return bin and like looking in the bin, trying to spot one of those covers.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll never forget the day I actually found one in the return bin, like right as it was returned. And there it was, a Goosebumps book. It was The Ghost Next Door. And I was just beside myself. I didn't know what the book was about. I didn't care. It was a Goosebumps book. And that was what everybody wanted to read. And the other thing about Goosebumps is I kind of credit that as what got me into collecting.
That makes sense.
I remember getting a book. I believe it was Monster Blood. My dad finally bought me one because he knew how into it I was. And I noticed that it was numbered. And suddenly I was like, well, I need every number. I can't have book 5 and 9 next to each other without the other books in between. And so I became sort of obsessive about collecting these books, and getting all the offshoot series and things like that. And that just never really went away. That was the first thing I remember, other than like action figures and stuff, but like actually wanting to collect and put on a shelf and look at it and keep it.
I have never tied those two together. That's a good thought.
Yeah. And R.L. Stine just in general is somebody I really, really look up to. I think people often undervalue gateway horror, content geared for kids that is of the spooky variety. There are things that get a ton of credit and get lauded, but, I think people look at someone like R.L. Stine and maybe kind of think of him as like a lesser writer sometimes, especially adults. So one of the main reasons I wanted to write about Goosebumps, other than it being its, big anniversary this year, was just calling attention to R.L. Stine and really like elevating him a little bit more in the horror community, talking about the stuff that we all remember from kids that maybe we haven't thought about in a while, and trying to spark, people to go revisit it. So
that is admirable for sure. And I completely agree on the gateway horror side. I kind of had that moment this summer because I've got a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I showed them Monster House for the first time this year.
Oh,
and
nice.
That movie is so much better than I remember. I had seen it in theaters and then probably once on home video, probably DVD, something terrible back then. But watching it this year was like, wow, this is actually extremely well made. The voice casting is perfect. It is genuinely creepy in a couple scenes. I loved that movie on reassessment this year.
Yeah, it's essential October viewing for me. I love that movie. I actually wrote about it maybe 2 years ago or a year or two ago for Bloody, for that very reason. Like, I think it's truly like an 80s kids movie brought to life. Like it could easily be a Goonies sequel, with supernatural elements. And that's a really interesting like production story too, because that was Dan Harmon co-wrote that movie, who went on to do Community and stuff. And originally it was conceived as a live action film, because that was an Amblin sort of Spielberg Zemeckis thing.
Right.
And it went all the way into pre-production, and they just decided that they couldn't do it because of the cost of like building an animatronic house. But just the idea of them like doing that live action is so amazing.
Another one that you wrote about that I wanted to hit on tonight, just how good is Death Becomes Her?
Oh, I love Death Becomes Her. Yeah, that's one of the great movies. I mean, it's a Tales from the Crypt movie without being a Tales from the Crypt movie. I think I've always felt that someone should just like edit in a Crypt Keeper intro to it. Like just literally just take one from the show. It almost doesn't matter. I'm sure you could find something that loosely works and add that like theme music at the beginning. And it would add a whole star to the movie just because it would give it the perfect tone. But no, I love that movie. It's so fun. And what a cast.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, only in the 90s could you get Meryl Streep, Bruce Willis, Goldie Hawn, like in what is essentially a highbrow schlock horror thing. Right. It's kind of astounding that it exists. So I love it.
With genuinely great effects too for its time.
Oh yeah. I mean and a funny anecdote about that movie is they always talk about the Jurassic Park wouldn't have been possible without the technology they developed on Death Becomes Her. So the ripple effects of these movies go to places you'd never expect.
Oh man, So what we really want to talk about is Hammer. And obviously, when you talk about Hammer, most people are probably not watching Hammer as their first foray into films. Most people are probably discovering that after they've gotten to some other things. So as we lead into that, what originally got you into film to begin with?
Into film in general, or Hammer? Oh, film. Well, I mean, I can't really pinpoint a specific thing. As a kid, I always gravitated towards movies. Disney movies were really my first thing. And I was in a household that wasn't a big movie household. My parents, it wasn't that they didn't like movies, but they didn't buy them. They didn't really go see them. I mean, it was more like we would rent a movie once a month. Right. And so whenever I had an uncle, though, who would buy me a movie for every like holiday or Easter or whatever, that would be like the gift he'd give me. So I slowly accumulated like 5 or 6 VHS tapes over these holidays, and I would just watch them on repeat. And it was like 101 Dalmatians and, whatever Disney movie was out. And I just like memorized these movies. And then when I was old enough to actually start like getting money and getting an allowance, I would always spend every dime I had on like a VHS tape or just any movie I could get. I almost didn't care what it was. I would be at the video store constantly just wanting to rent stuff. And I just had this appetite for movies. I couldn't get enough, and I wanted to see everything I could. And then finally I discovered Steven Spielberg at a pretty young age and like recognized that someone was making these things and that there was like a through line through their work if you paid attention. So he was kind of formative in my ability to sort of speak the language of movies, which I think he is for a lot of people of the last like 50 years, not just me. But it wasn't until later that I got into horror. I'm kind of a late bloomer to horror. I was always really afraid of horror. I got freaked out. I've talked about it before, but at a very young age, I caught a part of Child's Play late at night on TV, and it like completely destroyed me. It was the battery scene.
Nice.
Where his batteries aren't in there and he comes to life and attacks the mom. And I was like, I never want to see anything scary again. This was too much. And I stayed away from horror until like college. And, you know, then I saw Night of the Living Dead of all movies. And it just opened my eyes to, you know, what a horror movie was able to do.
Right.
That a drama or comedy or action film like maybe limited by their inability to go to extreme places. And, you know, I underestimated what horror was until that movie. And then after that, it opened up a whole world of like, oh, well, I got to figure out what influenced Romero, what led to this and what that led to. And, you know, like all horror fans went down my various rabbit holes until I found the things I love. But yeah, so I mean, it was kind of a journey to get to horror, but movies have always been a big part of my worldview.
Nice. With horror, and funny enough, I don't remember it because I was far too young, but supposedly when I was 4, I had a babysitter show me Child's Play, and I don't think it influenced anything, but my big one was Halloween at I think I was 8 years old, and just knowing how a genre like this, for a lot of us that are now immersed into cult cinema in some way, we have that definitive story, and it can usually be something that either scares us away for a long time or it makes you just super intrigued, yet somehow it always comes back as this interesting cycle, and it's something I've always wanted to look at, like what is that original story for some of the filmmakers in the industry or some of the people behind some of these frights that we're going in, what scared them when they were 6 years old and made them shit their pants, and then they came back to it 5 years later or something. So yeah, it's always nice to hear those origin stories. Hammer has a ton of origin stories. So we wanted to talk about a couple things tonight. First, we're going to talk about 5 entry-level Hammer horror films to get people into it, 5 amazing deep cuts, and then I've got a couple of the physical media releases offhand. We're going to talk about some of the best places to get them, some of the best versions of the releases, because now it has suddenly like opened the vault globally, and we're getting this from a handful of different places, and they're not always up to par with each other. So just want to make sure that people are watching out for the best ways to watch these. So first, can you explain to everybody what Hammer horror even is? And then we'll go into the 5 entry level.
Yeah, so Hammer was a British film studio that actually started making movies in the 40s. And for, 15 to 20 years, they really didn't do horror. They were more of action, comedy, thriller type of studio, and primarily they did what was called quota quickies. So what that was at that time in Britain, the Parliament basically required a certain percentage of the movies playing in British cinemas to be British-made films to help boost the economy, and so theaters and distributors were very willing to take almost anything that was British produced and release it wide theatrically in the UK. So as a result of that, they partnered with the BBC, and they would make film adaptations of their like Sunday night movie. They used to do these Sunday night teleplays on the BBC. It's actually where Peter Cushing became famous. And a lot of them were written by like, science fiction writers like Nigel Neal. And they would just take these plays and make them into movies very quickly at a very low cost. And so it was incredibly profitable. Well, that style of filmmaking eventually turned to, like I said, more science fiction. And they made a movie called like The Quatermass Experiment, which became very, very famous. And Professor Quatermass like was sort of the precursor to Doctor Who, and there were 3 Quatermass movies, one of which we might talk about later. But that ended up leading into like other movies, and Peter Cushing sort of making the leap from TV to the big screen through Hammer. And then in 1957, they made a movie called The Curse of Frankenstein. And that changed everything. That completely, it was a gigantic success. And we'll probably talk about that movie more in depth, but it showed them what horror could do for them financially. It showed them that horror was in a weird place globally as a genre. There was a lack of, I never want to make sweeping statements about a genre at a certain time, but there wasn't a definitive voice at that point for horror that was sort of dominating the marketplace like there was with the Universal monster movies and some of these other things. So they sort of saw a gap that they decided to try to fill. And so for the next, decade or so, they became the predominant voice in horror.
And predominant they were. They put out way more films than people realize, it seems. I think when people hear Hammer Horror, they think of a couple characters, and I've heard of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, right? And then they just stop there, and then you start going into, there's tens and tens and tens of films. It's not something that they were just done after a couple weekends and called it a day. This is such a phenomenon that it literally has like turned into its own genre. There are people like yourself that genuinely adore Hammer Horror, and it obviously evolved into this thing where they're not all similar necessarily, but they all have sort of kind of like with Dead Ringers. They have like a similar distinct personality, but kind of similar feel to a lot of them. And when you really start to dive in, there's so many different things that you can appreciate. So before we go into the like 5 easy picks for people to get into, what is it about Hammer that is something that you like have really felt drawn to?
Well, I think initially it was seeing the lush gothic approach to horror. There's a understated beauty to a lot of these movies. I wasn't used to, especially seeing horror from that time period, from the 50s and 60s, right? Because I've seen a lot of exploitation. I've watched a lot of that kind of stuff, but I hadn't seen the craft and attention to detail on display in these movies. And then I've always been a fan of like the underdog, the movies that like, or anything that feels like it's not given the credit that it's due. And these are movies that at the time were sort of lambasted by critics, were frowned upon by the elite film goers of the world, and thought as sort of trashy, which is hilarious because if you watch them now, they would be considered Oscar contenders. Like if Terrence Fisher's Phantom of the Opera came out today, it would be in talks for Best Picture. At the time, it was talked about like just the lowest brow trash you can possibly imagine. So I kind of like the ability to reassess these movies so many years removed. And then the other piece of it is they're so influential. Like you watch these movies and they feel so far ahead of their time because, it took about 15 years, maybe more, a whole generation really, for these movies to sort of manifest themselves in what we would, call American horror in the 70s and 80s. And there is a lot of Hammer influence. Their style of gothic horror. I mean, granted, you did have like the Corman Poe cycle over here in the early 60s, which was very much American Hammer through AIP. But, there's a difference between the stuff that was happening simultaneously with Roger Corman, and we talked about Mario Bava, who was doing the exact same thing. Like Mario Bava's debut film was Black Sunday, essentially. That was his. There were movies he made before that, but that was his first real movie, and that was a direct answer to Terrence Fisher's Dracula. So, there was a lot of stuff that was happening then, but the influence and the ripples of the studio are far and wide. And then, finally, it feels like so many people haven't seen so many of these movies. Right. Like Hammer is just, everyone knows what it is. It's like this weird ubiquitous thing that all horror fans are aware of. They can rattle off titles, they can rattle off actors, but so many people haven't seen these movies. And until a few years ago, they were very difficult to see. So now we live in a time where I don't think we know how lucky we are that all of these movies are just readily available on disc in pristine formats, you know, at our beck and call. So, yeah.
One of the things that really drew me in to some of the Hammer films, and actually probably tangentially Bava at the exact same time, because it's for very similar reasons, is that gothic side of things, because I was used to some of the older horror films from the US where we don't have that lush history. Like if you watch something from 1955 from Hammer, it doesn't look like a 1955 horror film from the US, primarily because the US is still kind of a very young country. When you look at some of these set pieces from some of these Hammer films, they're not like a backlot. This is like, we filmed this in a castle, and you can tell this is a real place and a real thing, with like that aspect of the film in itself is almost a character, with how realistic and like you can reach your hand out and touch it. It really is. Bava really nailed that with Black Sunday, and a lot of the early horror films from Hammer are the exact same way. So that's one of the reasons I got into it. But for those that have never got into it, I can't wait to hear your list of 5 entry picks. So let's start with the first one of those.
Sure. Yeah. And you know, when I think about entry stuff, I mean, sometimes there's a tendency to want to pull away from the obvious.
Right.
And I don't have that problem. I think sometimes there's a reason things are obvious, right?
I agree.
So for me, I would start at the start. I think Curse of Frankenstein, 1957 is where you begin if you're just wanting to get into Hammer. Were there horror films before that? Technically speaking, yes. You know, Abominable Snowman predates that movie, which we might talk about later because I like that movie quite a bit. But Curse of Frankenstein would be the first truly Hammer production that would go on to define their style for, you know, the next 5 or 6 years. And a lot of that is because at the helm of this movie is a man named Terence Fisher. And Terence Fisher's a guy who, a complicated man. He used to like to go to bars and play chicken with cars afterwards. And he broke his leg more than once and actually had to call off productions on things because of it. But one of the great directors. I always felt like it was a shame that Terence Fisher doesn't get brought up with the big horror directors. Like there's no reason Fisher shouldn't be mentioned alongside Bava or Romero or Carpenter or really anybody. I think he is one of those directors. And you have the screenplay written by a guy named Jimmy Sangster, who would go on to write many of the great Hammer films. I mean, one of the things, and then produced by a guy named Anthony Hines, music by a guy named James Bernard. Hammer is like a player's studio. Yeah. It's a repertoire. Like there are a group of people that kind of work together on all these movies for the most part. And as a result of that, you get a consistency of quality and an evolving level of craft throughout each film that is evident from frame 1 of Curse of Frankenstein. Not to mention, you know, I haven't mentioned Peter Cushing yet in this regard, and Christopher Lee. So this is Peter Cushing's sort of, to my mind, his breakout role. This was the role that really showed what he was capable of as a performer on screen. And then Christopher Lee as the monster is such a imposing figure, and it's so different than what we got in the US version. And much of that is because Sangster didn't watch it. He wrote this movie based on the book, not based on that version. And it has its own completely distinct identity. And it's fascinating and complicated and just gorgeous to look at. And, you know, when we talk about that gothic horror atmosphere, this movie is the template for that. Not just for Hammer, but for every movie that would go on to attempt to fit that gothic style. you can draw it all back to this film.
The first time I saw this, and God, I wish I remember the exact first time I saw it, but I remember it leading into one of those, and I'm sure most people that like horror like this have had these nights where, oh my gosh, I like that so much, I'm going to research for 4 hours to find out everything about it and everything related to it. And discovering what the world of Hammer was for the first time was because of this film. I knew that this was going to be one that you brought up in your first five. And the thing that I really wanted to touch on here is you brought up the whole repertoire aspect of everybody working together for the consistency. I think that might be one of the main reasons that this was so successful, because they have this completely different respect for theater. And it's something that is so classical to them that this is literally just like putting on a play for them. They had this crew, they had their set roles, they were all great at what they did. And when they came together and put on a new production, it performed like gangbusters. And with this first one, you can't really argue that anything is even a weak spot in that film. It is a really well put together, every single person working in tandem to just create a solid piece of art, and it genuinely comes out like that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's something about it, you know, that the Hammer does this really well, is the idea of the anti-hero.
Yep.
And that was something that, I don't know, it wasn't super common back then. Nowadays, that's like everything is it's like, oh, that's the trope. That's what we have to play off of because a regular hero is boring.
Yep.
Right. But when this film came out, Peter Cushing, he's such a likable, engrossing guy that throughout the film, I feel like you're constantly trying to justify his actions until you can't. And, you know, they also do something really smart. They introduce, character called Paul, who's sort of his pseudo father figure, who's introduced early on in the film and kind of helps raise Victor after his own father dies and he becomes the Baron, and they become incredibly close. And at the end of the film, you know, spoilers for a, you know, super old movie, but you know, Paul is sort of the one who kind of has to say, you know, Victor, you're taking this too far and break away. But there's also a level of Paul being complicit in this, right, because he essentially raised the guy. And it's not all on Victor, you know, and I think that sort of complexity is something that Hammer does very well. Everything is not black and white. There is murky gray area, especially when it comes to morality. And that mixes so well with that Gothic atmosphere. There's this era of the unknown, this sensibility that, you know, what you're doing isn't on either side of the line. It's right down the middle of the line, until you get to a point where you've gone too far, you've ventured too deep, and now you have to just kind of complete what you started out to do. And Hammer would take that lesson and run with it in a lot of different directions, but I don't think anybody balances it better than Terence Fisher. Even though he is somebody that has very stringent moral standards, as we'll sort of come to see later on in the Hammer run of movies. But he just, when he wants to explore that idea, nobody comes up with more compelling stuff than that director.
Well said. That's a great start. What do you think should be a second step?
So honestly, I went back and forth on this, but I think the next step is you just jump 1 year later and you watch Dracula. I think you watch these 1-2 punch. And even though, so for me, they're very similar in some ways because it's the exact same creative team for the most part.
Right.
Again, you have Fisher. But for me, I think it sets the template for Cushing and Lee. So the first film has Peter Cushing as the protagonist with Lee as the monster in a very small role. The second film, you know, if we look at it that way, Dracula keeps those same two at the forefront. But now Lee takes a little bit of a bigger role as the Dracula figure. And Cushing takes more of a moralistic stand as Van Helsing. And those two, when you look at these two as a pairing, you get to really see diversity of their dynamic as performers together. They're so good in movies together. And I think in this movie, you really get to see that dynamic in a completely different way. Because in the first film, in Curse, Lee is somewhat subservient to Cushing, until we get to a point where he breaks. In this movie, there's an intentionality to their relationship right from the start. Plus, I'm a huge fan of Dracula adaptations in general. I just love the various ways of approaching it. And this is such a unique one. And the way Dracula is handled. And it's such a different approach than we had ever seen before that point. I love Lee's Dracula. I think it is pretty much the definitive Dracula. The intensity, the sexuality, Hammer not being afraid to push those envelopes at a time when that was frowned upon. Again, these two movies show, I think, what they were doing that was so transgressive. The British Film Institute and everything else, like their version of the MPAA was constantly locked in battle with them to get them to cut stuff out. In fact, several shots of this film had to be edited, and some were believed lost for many years until like a random reel was found in like Japan that reinstated the dissolving face at the end of the movie. But yeah, there's some great effects sequences. It's great. A lot of great action. Again, they all shoot at this time, they shot in a place called Bray Studios, which was just basically a large English manor that they purchased and turned into a film studio. So it wasn't like a true studio. It was kind of like if someone, like if you think about Downton Abbey and they just made it into a movie studio, like, oh, we have this giant place, we can shoot films here. But as a result of that, like there were things you couldn't do in a traditional film studio. You could move a wall, so you could get the camera someplace it shouldn't be. And the wall was where the wall was. Exactly. So if they're shooting in a room, they had to shoot in that space. And that sort of constriction led to so much creativity. I think these two movies put back to back, when you think about the similar shooting locations and the same cast, they still feel like completely distinctive things with different voices, while at the same time, the same level of quality and a somewhat of a connective tissue. I think that really sets the stage for Hammer as a studio and what they're going to do over the coming years.
Yeah, with this one, it's difficult to even touch on this without immediately going to the fact that we have Lee and Cushing being so damn important. And I'm just grateful, looking back nowadays, that we can see so many films with both of those faces in it at the same time. Because in all reality, if that was happening nowadays, no studio would ever let that happen. It was just the same two people in all the same movies all the time. They absolutely would have fought back against that for typecasting reasons and everything else. But oh my gosh, just a gift to humanity. We can get their chemistry over and over again in a series of different characters. And that, I think, is what really showed the fact that they were both incredible actors. The fact that they could pull off literally everything that they tried to do together, it was always top-notch performances, and they're both just so magnetic. It is so hard to watch these and not fall in love with them. And that's again, you bring up the sexy aspect. A lot of the Hammer stuff was pushing that envelope so much more than other films at the time, that it's this maybe not sexy, but like elegant sensuality, maybe, that it's just like oozing, hey, you absolutely want to be a part of this. And it was so transgressive at the time. I loved discovering this period. It was just great.
Well, and them not being afraid to make the subtext text.
Exactly.
Like a vampire's fangs penetrating a woman's neck is obviously an allusion to something. But, in the US, especially under sort of Universal's watch, that was not something they were willing to explore. Hammer is willing to do that. And that was a big deal. Now it may not seem like it, but these were movies that awakened something in filmgoers. And I think it renewed interest in what horror was capable of.
During a very puritanical time, too.
Exactly. And the other piece of this is these franchises, Frankenstein and Dracula, bookend Hammer.
Yeah.
Right? Like Hammer begins and ends horror-wise with these films. In 1974, when they were about to shutter their doors, we got one final Dracula movie. Now, granted, Lee didn't return for it, but hey, it's still in there. And we got one final Frankenstein film. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing in that way. So I think if you're going to start with Hammer, I think you need to watch both of these. I think this is how you begin, because it's sort of, it will get you full circle in a way of what Hammer always was about and what they were really wanting to put out into the world and cling to. And something that Hammer, I love Hammer, but one of its downfalls was, it achieved relevance without specifically planning to, right? I don't think they of course did not realize how successful Curse of Frankenstein was going to be and what it would lead to. But after that, they kind of spent the next decade trying to constantly recapture that relevance by imitating themselves, as opposed to trying to perceive what was going to come next. And there were a couple times where they sort of stumbled upon that by way of bringing in outside voices. With like Kiss of the Vampire and some of these things that brought in once they bring the occult into the equation, that was sort of the next step. And I think that drove them through the 60s. I think without that, I think they would have floundered much earlier than they actually did. And it's a shame they didn't make it to the 80s, because they would have become relevant again. Imagine 80s Hammer movies.
Yeah.
80s Hammer movies would have been like the best movies in existence if we could have just got there. But anyway, but yeah, so I think for that reason, these two need to be on that sort of starter 5.
I agree there. Number 3 then.
So 3, this is where I start to kind of jump around, but for me, I got to go with Phantom of the Opera.
Nice.
So this is another, and again, running theme, another Terrence Fisher movie. And look, there were a lot of great directors that worked for Hammer. But I'll be damned if I don't think Terrence Fisher is the most influential, important voice. And the reason I want to pick Phantom, there's a lot of Terrence Fisher movies out there, and we might talk about another one. But the reason I want to talk about Phantom is this was sort of his baby. This was something that he felt really, really passionate about. This was, at the time it was made, it was 1962. This was Hammer's biggest, most lavish production. This was the one that they actually threw money at. Hammer was a pretty cheap studio. They generally tried to spend as little as was humanly possible, but when they got the rights to Phantom, they're like, caution to the wind, this is it, this is the one. So they went all out. And it was also a movie that Universal was very cautious about releasing the rights to. So it took a while for them to get it, but a series of events led to this becoming a thing. So part of it was The Man of a Thousand Faces, the Lon Chaney, sort of the movie about the life of Lon Chaney, that brought Phantom back into the conversation. Obviously, there had been a 1943 Claude Rains version that was very good, but it didn't do well, so they kind of let it go. And then, of all people, Cary Grant showed up at the London office of Hammer saying, "Hey, I'd like to do a project with you guys." And Anthony Hines mentioned that Phantom was something they had wanted to do, and Cary Grant's like, "Yep, I want to do it." So once they had Cary Grant's name, they fast-tracked production. Of course, Cary Grant did not appear in the final film and dropped out. It's also unclear whether he was going to be the romantic interest or the Phantom. There's a million different stories. You'll hear conflicting things. But at the end of the day, this movie comes out and it is a completely different version of Phantom of the Opera. And Herbert Lom ended up playing the Phantom. And it's a quiet, contemplative, romantic movie about art and the soul, and what it means to be human, what it means to create. And his relationship with Christine is less about, well, not that all of them are about lust and things like that, but I think it's completely distilled in finding the perfect way to create his vision. So for the Phantom in this film, Christine is of the only possible vehicle for his art to exist, and he needs her for that reason, and he needs to protect her, and he values that in her. And I think this movie really explores her wanting to feel valued for her talent, not for how she looks, because you also have a skeezy producer by way of Michael Gough, who would go on to play Alfred in the Burton Batman movies, trying to take advantage of her so she can star in a show, blah, 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 blah. So, and then the sets in this movie are just astounding. Like, he has this sort of underground sewer set. All this stuff was in a lot of it was shot in a back lot. So like you mentioned earlier, there's just, nowadays we're so used to CGI and things not really being there. You see this movie and it's all conceptually realized. It's brilliant, beautiful, foreboding, just haunting in all the best ways. And the other reason I wanted to highlight it is it completely failed to perform when it came out, unfortunately.
Which is crazy.
It is crazy. Well, a lot of it is the BBF. Okay, so they wanted it to have an A certificate, which means that it would have been suitable for children, essentially. They wanted anyone to be able to see this movie. So the BBFC made them cut out like 30% of the film, which is crazy if you watch this movie, because it is so tame. And as a result of that, the movie was really disjointed. It didn't make a lot of sense. If you've seen the movie, imagine 30% of it being cut out. And so it just didn't perform in the UK. Well, part of Hammer's deal with Universal in this film was they only got the UK returns. The US returns went to Universal. Yep. And in the US, it was released uncut and it did very well. So it wasn't that the movie completely bombed on its own. It was just the money Hammer got back from it was very poor. And after a string of, losses, this was sort of a bit of an end for the initial golden age of Hammer, what a lot of people refer to between those years of 1957 and 1962, and particularly Terence Fisher's sort of iron grip on the Hammer's output. Yeah. After that, you started getting an influx of a lot of different directors, which was actually really good for the studio, but I think it is a shame that we didn't get as much from Fisher. We went on to see plenty of other films from Fisher, but this was something that should have been a catapult moment, something that should have gotten Fisher's name out there with the horror greats, and instead it ended up sort of pulling him back a ways, which is a shame.
This is, I believe, one of the Scream Factory releases that came out just a couple of years ago. I can't remember the release date on this one, but it was done, let's see, August 11th of 2020. So this was at the height of the pandemic, and there was something at one of the groups that I'm in on Facebook. When this came out, some people discovering this, I was just overjoyed to see the reflection on this film from literally almost 60 years later and how it was still affecting people. I have watched this movie probably about 10 or 12 times, and with every single viewing, there's always something more to get out of this, because it is so much more than what's on the surface of this one, especially, and it feels like there's a lot more to tell for Fisher in this, because it's, again, like you said, it's just that much more personal. And I don't know what it is, but this one is just more of a relative story, I think, for a lot of people. And because of that, they're able to dive in and sort of just really invest in some of the characters in this movie. And I really adore that about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's got a great cast. Edward D'Souza as Harry is amazing. Heather Sears is a great Christine. And yeah, I should have been mentioned. I brought them all out. I have all the movies I'm talking about tonight. I have the corresponding Blu-rays sitting next to me. So this is nice. the Scream Factory Phantom. The first two movies we talked about, just to pitch it, are both available from Warner Archive in great releases.
Solid releases from Warner Archive.
Yeah. And Curse of Frankenstein is a 2-disc with a lot of the, commentaries you would want to have. And just, I mean, Steve Haberman, Konstantin Nasir are all a part of these, and some of the leading Hammer scholars. and wonderful transfers and everything else. So, but yeah, no, Phantom is a movie that like very much deserves the love it's now getting. For many years, I think it was considered lesser Hammer, and now it's reappraised because we have all these uncut editions. You know, it's like we're so spoiled because what we're seeing is the movies as they were intended to be seen. Most of these films, when they were first seen in theaters, like they got what they got, and that was it for 20 years. You know, so it's like it is rediscovery is very important, and I think modern viewers have trouble sometimes understanding that because we don't ever run into that. Like, you know, within a month of a movie being released in theater, we get 3 versions of it on Blu-ray. You know, it's like we get so much that we can't handle it, you know. Yes. But anyway,
I just did an interview recently with a Blu-ray label from Germany, and one of the things that they have been able to do is put out a release of a film that, because of the Nazi influence, it was unable to play the original version for literally decades. And so they, when they put out the Blu-ray, they were able to get the original censored version and also the uncut version. So it brought together 2 generations of German families to see, like, this is what I remember as a child, but also what the original film was supposed to be. And it's astonishing to think that so recent in our history, it is a completely different world to many of us and something that we can't even possibly imagine. So yeah, completely agree.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, these studios that are putting this stuff out, these labels are doing such important work for art preservation. And that's one of the reasons I can justify buying all these discs is I feel like I'm supporting this work. You know, when you buy from Vinegar Syndrome or, you know, Severin or whoever it is, like you're supporting important work on these movies and making it possible for other people, future generations to discover them, which is great.
Agreed. Let's go to number 4 then.
Sure. 4 is one of my favorite Hammer films. It is Plague of the Zombies.
Interesting.
So that is this guy here. I don't have the light. There we go. So Plague of the Zombies, another Scream Factory release. The reason... So this is one that some people might call a bit of a deeper cut. It's starting to get more conversation. I think the Scream disc really helped it get rediscovered. It's a John Gilling film, so directed by John Gilling. And it was one of those movies that was made back to back. So in 65, Hammer struck up a deal with 20th Century Fox that would lead to them making a handful of films in what was essentially an assembly line approach that had never been attempted. And within a matter of weeks, they were going to make 4 movies. And they were going to use like the same cast, roughly the same cast, roughly the same crews, same locations. And there was only going to be like, in some cases, like a week in between shooting. And the idea was to see, again, how inexpensively they could produce these things. And there was going to be an A feature and a B feature for each one. And the 4 movies were Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Rasputin the Mad Monk, Plague of Zombies, and The Reptile.
Wow.
And Plague of Zombies and The Reptile were going to be the B features, right? And Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Rasputin were going to be the A features. Dracula, Prince of Darkness, of course, being a very big deal because it was almost a decade since Christopher Lee had played Dracula and he was finally coming back. Yeah. You know, they had done a sequel to Dracula, which we might talk about, that did not have Lee in it, which is kind of a ballsy move at that time. Oh, yeah. So yeah, and then there was this. And what I love about Plague of Zombies is that this is a movie that really could have been devoid of any value. It could have been slapped together. It could have been a nothing movie. Instead, it becomes one of the most interesting zombie films I think that has ever been made. It's the only zombie film that Hammer did. And it was initially pitched to Universal. Universal as supposed to be part of their canon of Universal classic monsters, and Universal didn't like the zombie as a monster. They thought it was too, gross and upsetting. And this isn't even really like a Romero zombie film.
Right.
And it does predate Night of the Living Dead by several years. But what's interesting about it is you can see the beginnings of all of that zombie lore in this movie. In fact, there's even a graveyard sequence where zombies are like coming out from the ground, like just like they do in some of those later zombie, like Return of the Living Dead and Night of the Living Dead. And they are still sort of like control, like sort of the traditional zombie thing of being controlled by, you know, sort of a voodoo priest situation. So there are some questionable things in this movie. But man, oh man, does the zombie sequences really sing? And, you know, there's some great scenes where, you know, a zombie emerges over a hilltop at dawn, and, you know, picks up a woman. Like, it's just so the imagery is so striking and visually, terrifying. And again, just so reminiscent of what zombie movies would become. The reason I think it would be a good starter Hammer movie is it's a monster movie that's a one-off, which Hammer has a lot of. There's a lot of one-off, just, you know, here's the Gorgon, here's the reptile. There's a lot of movies that are just about one monster. This one also deals heavily in the occult and utilizing the occult to achieve dastardly aims, which is a very big thing in mid to late 60s Hammer. But it's not so black and white in terms of good and evil, like, say, something like The Devil Rides Out. It's a little bit more murky than that, which I find slightly more interesting. And again, it's a proto-zombie film. It's, you know, zombies became such a big thing in US horror. I think it's cool to see one that kind of predates that stuff, but very clearly influenced it. I never saw Romero talk about Plague of the Zombies, but I have to believe he saw it.
It is literally impossible. Some of the imagery in this, it is, I won't necessarily say lifted, but it is clearly what at least directly inspired many of the other zombie films. Again, the hands coming out of the grave in this film is easily, I believe, like the first time that we captured something like that on film, and to see it aped for years and years to come, it is such just a testament to how influential Hammer really was for those. I mean, honestly, such a short period of time. It's not like they were around for, you know, half of a century or anything. They had a very kind of limited run in the grand scheme of things, but they touched so many different things. This is like a perfect definition of that.
Yeah, and it's also a very like modern film. Like it's structured in a really modern way. Like, it has kind of a cold open that is alluding to something that happens later in the film, and it feels very like the plot just drives. It's just narratively, it speeds along. You're constantly fascinated by what's going on. It's engrossing. It kind of follows the Dracula narrative a little bit with sort of how the villain's set up and what they're attempting to do. And you've got an aging Hollywood actor stepping in to get a paycheck with Andre Morel. You got Michael Ripper in there, you know, so you got some of the Hammer regulars. You got the trope of them bringing in that American actor. There was some, you know, there's some behind the scenes funny stories about him being a jerk on set and not liking his co-star and stuff like that. But he does a great job. I mean, it's an engrossing movie. I really think, even though it's getting more talk now, I still think this is a really underseen movie, and I think it would be a great one to sort of indoctrinate you into what Hammer's all about.
Yeah, completely agree there. I think that this is one of the better offshoots that somebody could dive into, especially because of the influences that you can relate to a lot of the stuff that you've seen. It's like a perfect gateway to Hammer. Yeah,
for sure.
Number 5 then.
So 5. This was the one I really struggled with because there's so many things. And I was like, I could do something really different. I could do something later and it's canon. Instead, again, I went with something that is familiar to the stuff we've already talked about. But frankly, I just think it's too important to not watch. And I also think it is the definitive template for Hammer Gothic horror. Because it's a little bit farther into its run. It is 1960s Brides of Dracula.
Nice.
So Brides of Dracula is, for my money, the most gorgeous, lush production that Hammer did at that time. I mean, it is that and Phantom. I mean, it is just, the lighting in this movie is striking. Jack Asher's cinematography in this film is some of the most gorgeous, striking cinematography you'll ever see. There's no way you could watch this movie and not think to yourself, well, this directly influences the lighting you would go on to see in Giallo films.
Yep.
There's no way that Bava is not thinking about Brides of Dracula. I mean, there's like, there are non-diegetic light sources everywhere. There's like red light, green light. There's no reason for it to be anywhere, but everything's gorgeous. The costuming is it's so flamboyant, but also like perfect for the setting. Again, it's a Dracula movie it's a sequel to Dracula didn't bring Christopher Lee back, which is insane to me that they even made. They essentially had to lie to have it happen. They kind of misled the financiers saying, oh yeah, Lee's coming back. And then he didn't come back. They brought Cushing back as Van Helsing. So it's really just a Van Helsing movie. And it's Van Helsing sort of cleaning up the remains of Dracula's minions across the countryside. You get an incredibly different sort of villain in this movie with Baron Meinster, David Peel, who instead of being this like imposing, tall, dark, sort of raw sexual force, he is this meek, foppish, aristocrat who, is just very not intimidating at all.
Right.
But he uses his power of suggestion. He uses his influence to exact his will, and it's a different kind of terror. And you can see why that's very relevant to explore the vampire mythology. The other thing I like about Brides of Dracula, other than how great it looks, one of the best climaxes of any Dracula movie, even though it makes no sense, the best way Van Helsing ever kills a vampire is in this movie. But it also sets the stage for how important the vampire as a monster will be to Hammer. There is a lot of vampire content in Hammer's canon that is not related to Dracula movies. Yep. There are a shocking amount of other vampire films, and they're all really good, and they're all different. Hammer is so unafraid to introduce different types of vampires, different types of vampire lore, just because the vampire itself is so malleable as a monster. The fact that they can look human, the fact that they have human desires, the fact that there is a sexuality to them, the fact that, they still care to exist in a human world, and they need to. That's part of their survivals. They have to be able to remain there and not be bothered. There are complications to that sort of monster that isn't the case with some of the other ones. And this is a film that really sets the stage for the directions they could go. Plus, when we talk earlier about sort of that morality thing, this is the movie that pushes the moral high ground to a frightening level. This is the movie that shows that Terrence Fisher, he has a sense of morality about him that he really strongly believes in, but he also sees that if you push that too far, like Van Helsing is so driven by his morals that he's willing to do immoral things to accomplish what he thinks is right. So at what point do you stop being, moral? So morality is again on the chopping block in terms of what is right, what is wrong. But instead of having a dichotomy between sort of two characters, you really just have one guy who's just so singularly driven that it acts as a dissection of that morality. So
I swear Cushing is like the best at pulling that off. I don't think that anybody else could really pull off some of the way that he's able to portray. I don't know. There's like subtle movements in his acting that shows that he is motivated to do some of these actions, I guess, especially near the end of this film. This is another great one.
Yeah. And this is also one of those ones that shows that Cushing was determined to do everything himself. Like every practical physical stunt is done by Cushing. And it's just great. Yeah, it's a gorgeous, wonderful movie. A lot of people would put this towards the top of a top 10, and they would be right to do so. So even though we already did a Dracula movie, even though we've already done several other Terrence Fisher films, I just think this is, again, we're talking about starter Hammer. What are the movies that are going to show you what they're all about and really get you engrossed in their style? I think this would definitely be one of them.
It's foundational for sure. Before we go to the deep cuts, didn't warn about this question, but I'm curious. A lot of people that go deep into Hammer, they tend to at least dabble into some of the other companies like Amicus or Tygon. Are there any of those that you always felt drawn to, or perhaps appreciate maybe nearly as much as Hammer films overall?
I mean, Asylum is what. Oh, so I love anthology horror. Hammer didn't really do that. That wasn't Hammer's thing. But Amicus, Tyga, like that was anthology horror was sort of one of their bread and butters. And they made some of the absolute best ones, if not the best ones. Asylum is one of my favorite horror movies. I love Tales from the Crypt, the 72, 71 version. And then of course, Vault of Horror. So like the comic book sort of style of what led to Creepshow and stuff like that. Right. Those are the ones that really have always jumped out to me. I do like movies like, And Now the Screaming Starts, and I like The Beast Must Die. Like I like some of those like more cheesy kind of like every movie needs a werewolf intermission, where at the end you show all the pictures and you have to guess. Like I really think what was it? Werewolves Within should have had a werewolf intermission. I
agree there.
2/3 of the way through the movie, they should have just like paused and showed a picture of everyone and be like, who do you think the werewolf is? I love that kind of shit. I do like those movies quite a bit. We actually toyed with doing a sequel podcast to Hammer Pub calling Amicus Anonymous, and going through like all of the Amicus movies, and maybe someday we'll do that. But it's hard not to kind of fall for those movies when you're already into Hammer, because there's a lot of crossover.
There is, and again, we call them the anthologies. A lot of those they used to call them portmanteaus, but the anthologies that they made, they sort of laid the ground for a lot of the ways that we tell stories throughout multiple films nowadays. They kind of lead into some of these franchises that are like loosely connected, and I don't know what it is, but some of those old school anthology films are just so damn fun because they're charming and cheesy and done in a way that it just feels like a perfect Friday night. I love some of those old school films.
Yeah, well, and I think the great thing about an anthology is if you don't like one of the sections, just wait 15 minutes and you'll get another one, and it's there's a freeing sensibility to that. And then it also enables them to get a lot of different performers and actors that you may not have been able to get, because they only have to shoot for 2 days. And sometimes, again, the constraints breed creativity. There's a lot of great ones, but I think that when I think of Amicus and stuff like that, that's, House That Dripped Blood, From Beyond the Grave. Like those movies really jump out to me as being like my favorites.
Yeah. All right. So we did the starter 5. What are some of your favorite deep cuts?
Okay, I'll try to go a little bit quicker through these because I know I pontificated on the original ones a lot. But so for me, when I go to deep cuts, I think lesser seen. So my first one would be Abominable Snowman, which I sort of mentioned earlier. I like this one a lot because it predates Curse of Frankenstein. It was shot before it. I think it came out like right at the same time, so it kind of got buried by it. But it's also starring Peter Cushing. It was written by Nigel Neal, who was a prolific science fiction writer. He actually came in and did touch-up work on Halloween 3 Season of the Witch later on. But he wrote all the Quatermass stuff. So he wrote the Quatermass Experiment. So that's sort of his big claim to fame. But I adore this movie. It's one of their quota quickies. It actually has some shot on location stuff, which is very rare in Hammer's film history. And it's really just a bunch of guys going out in the Himalayas looking for the Abominable Snowman. And as they travel in this incredibly dangerous place, There's people out there who want to study it. There's people out there who want to kill it and take it back and get money for it. It's sort of, so it's less about the abominable snowman itself and more about the tensions between the people on the expedition.
Right.
And what men are, what humanity is capable of, seeing what we're not meant to see. It has a great Scream Factory Blu-ray, which is sitting beside me. And I love it. It's quiet, it's reserved, it's contemplative, it's kind of sad, directed by the great Val Guest. It's just one of those movies that has an incredible pedigree, and I think is one of the better Hammer horror films, but it just doesn't get talked about a lot. It's just lesser seen. But thankfully, Scream Factory has restored it, and the print looks great. So definitely check that out.
My big thing with this one is that for the year that it was made, it seems like they went above and beyond what I would have expected from them. And because it was a little earlier for them, I definitely could have seen this a few years ago, or a few years after that, maybe going this far. But yeah, this is kind of a shocking thing that they were able to greenlight as much as they could for it. What is your second one?
So my second one is a movie called Paranoiac.
Nice.
I really like Paranoiac. I've liked it for a long time. I initially saw this movie before Scream Factory started putting all these films out. Universal released an 8-film collection, an 8 Hammer film essentials collection that was pretty cheap. So I picked that up and watched all the movies on that, and Paranoiac was one of them. Paranoiac is one of its, what they called mini Hitchcocks. So it's not, they don't consider it a direct horror film, but it's more of a paranoid thriller.
Yeah.
But man, oh man, is it good. And it's Oliver Reed, and Oliver Reed sort of got his start with Hammer. And weirdly, I didn't talk about one of my absolute favorite Hammer movies, starring Oliver Reed, The Curse of the Werewolf. But Paranoiac is a movie where he plays sort of a spoiled rich kid who, his his estranged brother comes back, who's supposed to inherit, the family wealth, and he's acting really suspicious about it. And, they all thought he was dead. And so there's this whole kind of mystery at the heart of the movie. Is this guy, really the brother? Is something going on? What's up with Oliver Reed? But there are some incredibly haunting shots in this movie. Really, really, really well drawn thriller stuff that just, you can again, feels way ahead of its time. Pretty scary. An incredible performance by Oliver Reed. It's directed by Freddie Francis. So I thought, he deserved to be mentioned. Freddie Francis, of course, being an Oscar-winning cinematographer who shot most of Lynch's movies, later on. He's a really good director that, a cinematographer that also could direct the hell out of a movie. And Paranoiac is one of those films that I just don't think gets enough love. And it just got a special edition Scream Factory release, which is a really nice release with a new transfer. And a lot of these transfers were done in-house by Hammer, over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And some of them were released in the UK. They just never made their way over here. So it's nice that Scream is sort of porting over some of these transfers too.
And the big thing is they could have probably gotten away with not doing a lot of extras, but a lot of these, they're doing quite a bit on. And if I remember, I think this one has an interview with, Kim Newman, who is on a lot of these releases. And Kim Newman, if you've never listened to Kim on anything before, he brings this scholarly impact of films that you just would never think to dive into. The one that I really, really felt compelled by what he did on was Let's Scare Jessica to Death. I loved what he said about that film. But if I remember right, he talked about something on this with regards to Hammer going after some of the bigger characters that they started to adapt. And it I don't know, just the gravitas that Kim Newman can bring to some of these releases is always nice to see. Genuinely, like the context behind why this was such a big impact, and Hammer not really, because what year did this one come out? Do you remember offhand?
This was 63. Very early. I think it was 63.
Okay, yeah, 63.
Because it was right after. Well, because they wanted to like cash, because Taste of Fear was supposed to cash in on Psycho,
right?
And then this is, and like Les Diaboliques was like a big influence, and then so this was sort of in that same vein. They were like, oh, we can cash in on the Psycho success, and use Oliver Reed as like the front runner because he was kind of becoming that golden boy for them. And yeah, no, it's a great Blu-ray. And the commentary by Hollenbeck is really good. Bruce Hollenbeck's commentary on this one, and he talks a lot about sort of like the impact of the studio, what they were attempting to do with it, the various people who were a part of it, how this impacted their careers,
right?
Sort of the ghoulish thematics at play that weren't normally explored in these types of movies. Because, again, we liken a lot of these movies to Psycho, while at the same time, I think sometimes forgetting what Psycho really was. Much of Psycho was beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we remember Psycho more as if it were like its sequels, like as if it were a slasher, and it's not. It really isn't.
Not at all.
But what Hammer was doing was more in that vein. Hammer was taking that one core idea of Psycho and saying, well, let's really exploit that,
right?
And see if we can ratchet up the tension for 80 minutes.
And the crazy thing, they were doing that like 8 times a year.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like, they had so many different plates spinning at any given time because they were releasing this, but also these big direct horror movies. Like I said, they didn't consider the mini Hitchcocks in the same vein as their horror films. There hundreds of movies were released over Hammer's run, but the only ones that get talked about are like 6 titles, right. And granted, I'm not helping anything by mentioning 4 of those 6, but at the same time, like, that's why I think a movie like Paranoiac is worth bringing up. Nightmare is another one that's kind of good. The Snorkel is pretty good. Like there's a lot of stuff that doesn't come up very often, but I think Paranoiac is one of the better ones. And certainly one of the most accessible. And again, even though these movies are getting released, I still feel like Paranoiac has not found the audience that it deserves. Right. And I think if more horror, I think if Joe Bob showed Paranoiac, I think everyone would be losing their shit over it. That kind of thing.
I could actually see that happening with a film like that. Yeah. Okay, so I think that was that number 2 or 3?
2. My 3. So my 3 is Countess Dracula.
Ooh.
From 1971. So this is Ingrid Pitt. So this is late Hammer. This is when many people started saying, well, Hammer's not good anymore. Once we hit 1970, a lot of people write off Hammer's output. And I think, and we'll talk about a couple 70s Hammer films now, because I would say they oftentimes are the deep cuts. I think 70s Hammer is got some really great stuff going in it, and I think they were taking a lot of risks. The other thing about 70s Hammer is they were allowed to do stuff that they could not do before, and it becomes very apparent. So sexuality gets amplified tenfold, violence. Now, sometimes to their detriment, like with To a Devil, a Daughter, which is not a movie I'm going to recommend. But with a movie like Countess Dracula, which is, I feel like, poorly titled. Because I think with a title like Countess Dracula, audiences are expecting something specific, right? You're expecting basically female Christopher Lee. And that is not what this movie is at all. It is a very sort of intuitive, emotional, very just deeply disturbing look at a narcissist, powerful woman who essentially discovers that she can stay young and beautiful forever if she bathes in the blood of young, innocent women. And she uses her beauty to enlist men and other people to sort of help her kidnap and collect these victims to sustain herself. And it just goes into some really interesting places. Like I said, it's not afraid to be like sad. It's not afraid to actually like provide real characterizations that have real consequences and impact. It's got like amazing performances from its supporting cast. Really haunting movie. It's a movie that I didn't watch for a very long time because I just assumed it wasn't great. And when I finally saw it, I was like, this is one of the best Hammer films.
Wow.
It's available in a couple different versions. Synapse put it out at one point. Now there is there's an Indicator box set called Hammer Horror. You can see it on my little camera.
Isn't that Imprint, not Indicator?
Imprint. Yeah, not Indicator. I'm sorry. Imprint. And it's got Countess Dracula, Hands of the Ripper, Twins of Evil, and Vampire Circus, all late era Hammer movies, most of which I think were all released at one point by Synapse. But some of them are out of print, and then these are all new transfers with a bunch of new special features, really great packaging. Very much worth getting that box set. Imprint is one of those companies that is weird about things going out of print. So I don't know if that's still in print anymore, but it is, it's my favorite versions of those. I actually retired my Synapse versions when I got that. I compared the transfers, and pretty much all of the special features that the Synapse ones have were ported over. And then these have additional special features.
Nice.
So very much worth having, but yeah. That's a great movie.
I don't think I've seen that film since the Synapse Blue came out, and I don't. That may have only been the one time that I've seen it. I hardly remember this one at all, unfortunately. Imprint is wild. I will say that when that came out, they were releasing more of their releases. They were doing like 2,000 to 2,500 copies. For some reason nowadays, they've lowered a lot of their stuff to 1,000 to 1,500 copies. So it may still be in print, but also Imprint stuff is rather pricey, especially if you're importing, because they're in Australia.
Yeah, my recommendation is try to get it through Diabolic DVD if you can. Yeah. That's because for example, I'm a huge Warriors fan. And when they did The Warriors, that was the first time that the theatrical cut was available on Blu-ray. So that was like a big deal for me, because I don't know about you, but I'm not a big fan of the 2000s director's cut with the animated interstitials. I think that really detracts from the experience of The Warriors.
Just a little bit.
So to get the theatrical cut, that was something I was willing to pay for. But I was, I looked at importing it. Importing it was over $100. It was like $120
for one movie.
For one movie, essentially. On Diabolic DVD, it was like $50. So it's like, it's much more reasonable when you get it that way. But I totally understand they don't always have copies in stock, so it's up to the person. But yeah, that's the site I always try to use if I can to do some of these imports. But yeah, you just got to pick and choose.
I did just check; it's out of stock at Diabolic, and I'm betting that it's out of print at this point, because I think that was one of their earlier releases.
Yeah, it probably is. I'm trying to remember, because I think the first thing I ever bought from them was Breakdown and maybe Hard 8. Those are the two that and now of course Breakdown has a US Blu-ray. Of course, the minute I buy one, there's a US version, but their Breakdown is really nice. So. Yeah, of course, I'm getting off on a tangent.
This came out August of 2021, and Imprint stuff, like nowadays, it's going. One of their releases just went out on pre-order. It went out of print, so I imagine by now this one is likely out of print, since it's been almost a year and a half.
Yeah, it's great label, but yeah, it's pricey and hard to get, so you have to kind of jump on it. But
this is true.
Yeah, I mean, with me, any collector, I think in this day and age, like you just have to be careful with where you spend your money, because you could get a little too deep. So I try to be a little bit more like, okay, what do I really want in my collection? What do I need to upgrade?
Exactly.
Especially if it's a title I already own. But Countess Dracula, any way you can watch it, I would recommend it. I think it's, again, if you haven't seen it in a while, I would definitely recommend giving it another watch. Absolutely.
That sounds great. Number 4 then.
Number 4 is my favorite, and this is a contentious pick. This came up a lot on my the podcast, The Hammer Pub, Jinx would give me a hard time for this because this is my favorite mummy movie of Hammer's, and I'm picking it over the quintessential 59 Mummy with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Not because I think it's a better movie, but because I think it's way more fun. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, 1971. I think this movie is one of the most fun Hammer movies there is. One of my co-hosts loves Vampire Circus because of how ridiculous and fun it is.
Yep.
I would put this movie in a similar vein. It's too many mummy movies get wrapped up in very boring iconography. Yeah, right. Thank you. It just very slow. The mummy itself is sort of how the movie is set up, right? It's like slow moving, not a lot happens. The plot is often very convoluted. This is a movie that goes, right? It just runs as fast as it can. When it comes to Hammer's very famous for its beautiful women. Not to get misogynistic about it, but this movie stars probably one of the most beautiful women Hammer ever had at their disposal. And she is given the juiciest, meatiest role to just be beautiful and yet commanding and use her beauty to destroy people in a way that isn't depressing like it is in Countess Dracula, where, Ingrid Pitt is also doing the same thing in Countess. This is why I like it as a back-to-back with that. Nice. Ingrid Pitt's doing something similarly, but it's sad. This is just kind of fun. Valerie Leone as the resurrected mummy, just sort of being gorgeous and perfect and then destroying people on her way to collect little artifacts. So there's also a MacGuffin element to this movie where there's missing artifacts that they have to collect. I just think it's a very good time. It's based on the Bram Stoker novel, The Jewel of 7 Stars. So it's got kind of this classical storytelling element to it. It jumps around a lot. It's very modern feeling. It's a quick watch. It's a lot of fun. It's a movie that I don't hear talked a lot very often. Again, it's a late Hammer. But I just have a great time with it, and I think it's very much worth watching. It has a Scream Factory Blu-ray.
Love that cover.
Great cover. So I just highly recommend checking that one out if you haven't, or if it's been a while, or you just want to have a drink and watch a fun movie. This is a good one for that.
If I remember right, isn't this the one that Cushing was supposed to be in, and then something happened and he left during production or something?
Yeah, so this was when his wife passed away.
Okay.
So he shot for 2 days. So they actually did get some footage with him, and then his wife fell ill again, and it was clear that it was going south, and so he said, I have to go. And Hammer having the relationship they had with him let him out of his contract, of course. But I mean, I hate to say it that way, but not every studio would have been as understanding. And they reached out to Andrew Keir, who played Quatermass in Quatermass in the Pit. Is amazing Quatermass. And he was sent the script on a Friday night and said, be here by Monday to do the movie. Kind of thing. And so he had to very quickly adapt and figure it out. But truth be told, I think he does an amazing job. I mean, I don't think you can really, he's a consummate, professional. Yeah. But I can't tell that he didn't know what the hell he was doing. And part of that, again, is the tone of this movie is fun. Right. And there aren't a lot of Hammer movies that wanted to make a fun, silly horror flick. That wasn't very common in Hammer's repertoire. So I think I kind of see this as a breath of fresh air. When we were doing Hammer Pub, this is one of the later films we got to. And when we got to it, it was just oh, this is nice. This is a good time, kind of like Captain Kronos. Let's just have a good time. So
I think that it would have been fun, like we mentioned earlier, to see Hammer go into the 80s and kind of lean into the camp aspect a little bit, because really they did not get a great chance to do that at all.
No, and this is a movie that could have been you could have retooled this into a great 80s mummy movie,
Yep.
like truly spectacular. And I think it's underappreciated because I think because it's just kind of there to have fun, I think people write it off when they're going through Hammer's filmography. But I think if you return to it with fresh eyes and just kind of view it for what it is, I think people will have a better time with it.
I'd agree there. Okay, final one. What is your final deep cut?
Well, my final deep cut, and again, some of these movies are getting second lives, but man, oh man, this has always been, the first time I heard this title, I was like, this just sounds like a deep cut. The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. This movie is just a blast. It is absolutely amazing across the board. It is the final Dracula movie. Christopher Lee did not come back, but Peter Cushing does as Van Helsing. It is a Shaw Brothers collaboration, and it shows the movie is torn between being a Hammer production and a Shaw Brothers production. It can't quite figure out which one it is. And as a result of that, we get like crazy gothic atmosphere with insane, like weird costuming and martial arts effects. We have martial art vampire zombies. I said Plague of the Zombies was the only zombie film, although one could argue that Seven Golden Vampires constitutes zombie status. I mean, we literally have vampires rising from graves. Just they look like their faces are rotting off. They just look like zombies, and they're wearing like golden crowns and stuff like that. It's an absolute blast. We get a Transylvania flashback to Castle Dracula. We get all kinds of just over the top action scenes. We get romantic subplots that don't really go anywhere. I talked about, the last movie, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, being a fun movie. This is a fun movie. This is an 80s kind of style movie. It came out, its actual release was late 70s, but it was made in 74, and it was absolutely butchered. In the edit. It was released over here as The Seven Brothers Meet Dracula was the title.
I knew that one. Wow.
Yeah, and it was chopped down. Like, it's already a short movie, and they cut out like 20 minutes and then looped sequences. Jeez. So there were loop sequences in it. And that's how it was. Yeah, I think it was cut down to a 75-minute runtime. And it was just almost unwatchable. That cut is out there and it is bad. And that was how American audiences saw it until like the 2000s. That was just the cut we had. So I think of it as a deep cut because I think people who did see it didn't really see it.
Right.
Or give it a chance. And I think it is just a hell of a lot of fun. And it showed, again, Hammer's versatility, their ability to see, hey, we need to reach out, working with the Shaw Brothers, like, let's collaborate, let's do different things. Like, Hammer was not afraid to take risks like that, whereas a lot of other studios would not do it. Yep. And it's really a shame that wasn't able to be carried forward. But yeah, this was really one of the final nails in their coffin, so to speak. But Seven Golden Vampires is an absolute blast. It's great to see Peter Cushing show up as Van Helsing one last time. I love the idea that he's like touring, touring the world, giving like speeches about vampires in scholarly classrooms. That it doesn't make a lot of sense why they would be listening to him or interested in what he had to say. It's one of those nonsensical sort of setups that you just kind of accept because it's in a kung fu fighting vampire movie. Yeah. And that wasn't something that you normally got out of your Hammer. So to actually see that mixed with the production values that you were used to in Hammer for the most part, and the creativity that comes out of that it's just a really refreshing watch and a very fun one at that. And of course, it does have a Scream Factory Blu-ray to watch, so you can check it out that way.
Every time I've seen this, I have simply tried to picture what it would have been like if Lee would have come back as well. And if they had kept a lot of the same features in this film and then added Christopher Lee just to have that sort of intimidating stance throughout this entire, it would have been a completely different feeling. But I'm glad it went a little madcap and that they could cap it with this, because it's pretty damn good.
Yeah, it's a little odd to me that he was willing to come back for Satanic Rites of Dracula.
Right.
But hey, whatever. I think at that point Lee was just, pay me this, and if they said yes, he would have, and they didn't say yes. Lee's stories are often very conflicting about the vampires, the Dracula stuff too. So it's just, but no, I love this movie. I think it's really fun, and again, I think for most people this would be a bit of a deep cut.
Oh, absolutely, and especially before that Scream Blue. I think there was a DVD, but I don't think there was any other Blu-ray release before that, right?
No, not that I know of. I think there were all of these had UK releases.
Well, yes.
And I will say, if you have the Scream Factory Blu-ray, you do have that US theatrical cut, the Seven Brothers Meet Dracula. It's on there, so you can watch it, and you can see what I'm talking about. It's something.
Wow. So to wrap things up a little bit, we were talking about the different releases between the UK, the US, and even earlier we mentioned Australia. Hammer has gotten to the point where I hate to use this word because it kind of has a negative connotation with it, but I'm going to say it a little bit. It's a little bit fragmented. If you really want to piece together like the best of the best, it isn't something where you can go like a one-stop shop to any of these places. It feels like, to me at least. Obviously, a lot of the Scream Factory releases are incredible. Really great art, really great supplements. If you want to go budget, one of my choices that I've recommended to quite a few people. What do you think about the Mill Creek Hammer film set?
Yeah, I really like that. Well, I mean, that's also, I have that right here. It's one of the only ways to get several of those movies.
Right.
You can't complete your Frankenstein collection without it, or the 2-pack that they released previously, Revenge of Frankenstein. There's some double dips on there, but at the same time, I think Curse from the Mummy's Tomb is only available through that. It's got one of my favorite Hammer films that isn't horror, but Cash on Demand. I don't know if you've ever seen that. The Peter Cushing. It kind of feels like a Christmas Carol sort of story. He's a Scrooge-like figure, but it is. If you haven't seen, if someone out there watching hasn't seen it, it's amazing. So I think this set is worth it for those handful of titles alone. Plus, it fleshes out, we didn't talk about them, but the swashbucklers. Hammer made a ton of pirate swashbuckler movies. One that sort of crosses genres is Captain Clegg or Night Creatures, which I contemplated putting on one of my lists because it's one of my favorite Hammer movies, but another Peter Cushing starring movie. But yeah, no, that Mill Creek set is great, and if you can get it on a deal, it's a I think I got it for $20 on sale.
It goes on sale for 20 multiple times a year. Dirt
cheap for a ton of movies, so that's absolutely worth it. They're not the best packaging presentation, but like you said, if you're fleshing out your collection, I mean, Scream Factory is really the studio doing, or the label doing the most work. They've put out a ton of special collector's editions, standard editions, just really fleshing out our ability to have these movies. Most of the transfers are either new transfers or ported over from Studio Canal, who did all the work in the UK. Unfortunately, when I first started getting into Hammer, I actually imported a lot of those Studio Canal releases. So I ended up rebuying them when they came out here. But it was worth it, I'd say. But it enables me too to compare the transfers. Right. And like I said, if they don't advertise it as a new transfer, 9 times out of 10, it's that Studio Canal transfer.
The other big UK thing that people are always going back to are these imprint box sets, or indicator box sets.
I did, sorry, I messed you up.
We did the opposite earlier. These are, I will just say, remarkable releases. For anybody that hasn't seen them, I think they've done 6 of these now. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's 6. Yeah.
Very different themed throughout all of them. Some of them, one of them, I believe, is just all the swashbucklers. Not all of the films, but the box set is all swashbucklers. This one is very out of print, but some of the best films in the entire collection that they put out. We've got The Gorgon on here, Maniac, Curse from the Mummy's Tomb, and Fanatic. And the just Indicator is one of those weird companies where they are so consistent and so like respectful to the thing that they are trying to preserve that it's hard not to just genuinely be impressed with what they put out. But now, like, if you're going to go after this box set on the secondhand market, it's like $250. It is stupid money.
Yeah. And it's hard too, because all those titles are available through these other sets. So it's tough. Yeah. As a collector, I think those sets are worth it more for like, you know, the packaging and because the artwork is great. And if you're like really a huge Hammer fan, they're worth owning on that alone. But if you just want the movies, you know, that Mill Creek set is great. And pretty much everything Scream Factory is doing, although the Scream Factory ones aren't cheap either.
No.
You know, they do cost. And especially if you're trying to get like, oh, I want the collector's edition with the slipcover, you know, that's going to, some of those are tougher to get now. But like I said, don't forget about Warner Archive, because, you know, they have several of the Draculas. Like I said, they did Horror of Dracula. They did Dracula AD 1972. They did Satanic Rites. So there's a couple of things that you kind of have to get through them.
Yep. That Frankenstein release especially. Yeah,
Curse of Frankenstein is an essential release. And that had never been put out here. There was a Curse of Frankenstein Studio Canal release that I had imported, but the transfer on this release is like 10 times better. Like, it was striking how different it was.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, we're living in a time of, you know, accessibility for these movies, which is great. That's the best way for them to get rediscovered.
And now we also mentioned the imprint box set. Even Second Sight in the UK has put out. Is it just 2 releases that they've done so far?
Yeah, they did Frankenstein the Monster from Hell. What else did they do? Did they do? No, I know they did Man with the X-Ray Eyes at one point, but that wasn't Hammer.
Oh, yeah, that was a long time ago.
But that was kind of in that reminds me of a Hammer movie.
Right.
But yeah, they're going to start releasing like nice special editions with embossed
the other one
covers.
was The Mummy.
Oh, The Mummy. Yep. Which had a U.S. studio release. That was one of the few Hammer movies that Universal just put out on Blu-ray, which is weird. I don't know why they decided that was the
odd
one.
choice. Yeah.
But yeah, that was available. That is, I think, still available. It was a cheapie too. It was like $7 or $8. But yeah, no, the Second Sight was a brand new transfer, tons of new special features, really great packaging. So again, yeah, a glut of ways of collecting these things. And Second Sight has done some of my favorite box sets, I'll say, just as an aside. Like their Drive box set was amazing. They just did, because they're doing Martin too, right? That's coming soon. I'm really excited about that. So yeah, look forward to seeing what else they do with Hammer.
I'm curious to see how many they got, because it was interesting. Those Second Sight does this odd thing probably once, maybe twice a year, where they're like, oh, surprise, these are dropping in 2.5 weeks. You can order them now. And nobody saw them coming. And they did that with these 2 Hammer releases. And I think that kind of took away from the, hey, these are really nice kind of period that they would have gotten if they would have had a little more fanfare, I feel like. But I don't know. They are really great releases. They look really good. Genuinely great extras. They both have a nice book. That's another thing Second Sight always does. Every single one of their hard box releases has this amazing book with like contextual essays and something at least to explain the impact of the film and maybe discuss some of the themes and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. No, like I said, I'm a huge fan of them, and they're easy to order from too. They don't upcharge too much for the import and stuff like that. So definitely worth it.
Yeah. So Imprint, Second Sight, Scream Factory, Warner Archive, Indicator. It seems like there are a lot of. Oh, and Mill Creek. I didn't even mention. And I think this one was it 20 films on. Yeah, 20 film set. There is a lot of different options out there. I think there's only like a handful that we don't have on Blu-ray anywhere, right? Are you keeping track on that at all?
At this point, we have most of the major ones are available. I can't think of one of the core 50 or 60 titles when you think of Hammer Horror that isn't available on Blu-ray now. I know there's some like I said, the mini Hitchcocks, a few of the swashbucklers I think are unavailable. But yeah, I think everything else has gotten a release.
Nice. That's God, that's so exciting. Just the fact that the studio can live on in a legacy like that. Anyways, Paul, do you have anything else you want to shout out tonight? I didn't mean to take so much of your time. This has been incredible to be able to talk to you like this.
No, this was good. Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Like I said, I tend to be a bit long-winded, so forgive me for that.
Especially with people that I connect with, I seem to want to be able to just talk for hours and hours. So I could dive into Hammer for forever, and it seems like
Hammer is definitely a topic that I could just talk about forever. I appreciate you having me on. Like I said, I'm always down to talk Blu-rays, movies, Hammer, whatever. But hopefully this gives anybody out there listening or watching a couple ideas. If they haven't checked out Hammer yet, this would be a good road into it to see if you find something you love in there.
I agree. Everybody, all the relevant links for Paul are in the link or the description below. If there is any questions on those, feel free to ask, and follow Paul on Twitter. See if you can get some answers to those from him as well, since he's the expert. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll see you all next time.